time. So let me get started at the beginning here. So welcome to our Edible Florida class. Dawn Philpott, one of my awesome Master Gardener volunteers, is going to be giving the talk today. Before we get started, I just wanted to do some quick housekeeping. So the chat box is disabled for today just to make it easier for us to keep track of questions. If you have any questions, you can type them into the Q&A box. If you'd like to be unmuted and ask a question, you can raise your hand. For those of you that would like to ask on air or ask a vote with your voice, we'll probably be holding that until the end. Whereas Q&A box, I'll be trying to read those questions out as we've got time, or if we're running out of time, we'll hold those for the end as well. This is part of the University of Florida IFAS Extension. UF IFAS Extension is part of the University of Florida, which is a land-grant university. Their mission is to research new things about food and agricultural sciences, as well as family and consumer sciences, and then teach that to the students at the University of Florida, and then also extend that into the communities around Florida, which is my job. I'm an extension agent, and I take the research from the university researchers and translate that into things that you can actually use at home. We also have 4-H agents here in the county that deal with teaching children and other youth about these different cool new research information. We do family and consumer sciences where they'll teach you about making food healthily and balancing your finances. We have our Florida Friendly Landscape agent who deals with all the Florida Friendly landscaping principles. And we have a agricultural sciences agent who deals with our farmers here in the county and food systems. I'm Katie McCormick. I'm the residential horticulture agent and Master Gardener volunteer coordinator for the county. So I deal with all the residential questions that come in about what's going on with plants, insect identification, plant identification, and I also train our Master Gardener volunteers. We have quite a few classes coming up in the next few months. These are just a quick selection. So if you'd like to learn about landscaping appropriately in Florida to make sure that you aren't harming our natural waterways, we've got landscape fertilization in Florida coming up in a couple weeks on June 30th. Next, in 2 weeks, I think, on June 23rd, I'll be teaching summer color gardening. This is going to be all about the annuals and perennial plants that you can grow in your garden this time of year for lots of color, as well as talking about some color theory. And then the big thing that we're doing in the office for this summer is our Get Your Grove On series. We'll be doing 6 weeks talking about different fruits and how to take care of them here in Central Florida. So if you're interested in that, all of those are available on our Eventbrite page. I'll also be sending you a copy of this recording along with these slides whenever after class today. So keep a lookout for that. And with that said, Dawn, you're welcome to start sharing your screen.
Okay, move that up.
If anybody's interested in becoming a Master Gardener volunteer, if you look up Seminole County Master Gardener, I do have the application up already, although I haven't updated our due dates yet on our website, but you can find the application online. And with that, I'll pass you guys over to Dawn.
Okay, well, hello everybody. I want to talk about Edible Florida, really. So one of the things that I'm really interested in is stuff that is out there that you can actually eat or you can use for medicinal purposes. And I'm a volunteer at Wekiwa Springs State Park, and we've identified 1,700 plants that are edible or have medicinal uses just in the Central Florida area. So there is no shortage of them, and almost all of these can be planted in your garden. And one of the things that I'm really concerned about is, weeds, because I don't believe there are any such things as weeds. They're just plants in the wrong place. And one of the things that we do at Expo, or have done over the last couple of years, is we've shown that about 15 of the 20 most common weeds found in lawns, they're all edible. And I think just throw 2 statistics out there from Bloomberg that we spend $40 billion a year on lawn care, and most of that's on pesticides and herbicides, when most of and that's to kill the weeds in our lawn, when almost all of those are are edible. So instead of putting chemicals on, we should be actually eating our way out of a problem. And another scary stat is that in 2019, we put 30,000 tons of pesticides on our grass. That's not just our lawns, but on green spaces, parks, golf courses, that sort of stuff. Edible plants fall into sort of three categories, really. There's foraging for fun, which is what we do when we go out, and if we're walking a trail, for instance, there is berries and fruits, and again, sort of things you have in your backyard, maybe. So foraging for fun is when you're eating things that are tasty. There's foraging for medicinal plants, and we'll talk about those later. And there are many of those, and most of these are centuries old or have been used for many, many years. They almost have no side effects at all. They're free, and they're tried and tested. And then there's foraging for survival, and we use the picture of the guy chomping on a twig. Surprisingly, there is nutrition to be gained from chewing on a twig, as long as it's not something like a poison sumac, which is not advisable. But if you are in a survival situation, you can actually eat some of the twigs. So, and the other thing I want to talk about with our plants is that people think that foraging is random, but it really isn't. That you can actually get a really nice, balanced, nutritious diet if you know what to look for. And eelgrass, which you find growing in our rivers, is one of the richest natural sources of carbohydrates, for instance. It's also an excellent sign if you see eelgrass, because it means the water quality is good. Groundnuts, massively rich in protein. Ragweed, natural healthy oils. Saw palmetto berries are good in fatty acids, although it's very difficult to actually find palmetto berries because the gopher tortoises and the deers love them. But you've got things like nettles and purslane leaves, which are rich in vitamins and minerals. Cattails roots can be made into flour. Hydrilla, which has been a problem in Florida for many, many years, and they spent literally hundreds of millions of dollars trying to eradicate it. It's an invasive aquatic weed that forms huge blankets that smothers other plants. Now in the north of Florida, they actually harvest hydrilla. They dry it, and you can buy it in food shops as a food substitute. And then there's yaupon, which is, we'll talk about that a little later as well, but it's the only naturally occurring plant that contains caffeine in North America, but it's also packed with antioxidants. Some definitions about edibles. Edible obviously means you can eat it. Palatable means you want to eat it. Poisonous means you can eat it, but in moderation. A lot of people think poisonous plants are not edible. In fact, they are. And the best example of a poisonous plant that I can think of is rhubarb, which contains oxalic acid. So if you eat too much of it, it will damage your liver and kidneys. But in small quantities, in moderation, it's okay. And toxic, of course, means you can't eat it at all. And the old rule about foraging is all plants are edible once. So just, we know there are about 1.4 million plant species in the world. I mean, that's a silly figure in a way, because there are millions that probably haven't been identified yet, and millions more that have come and gone. But of the plants that we know about, 250,000 of these are edible. About 170 are cultivated in some places, and 12 species provide 75% of the world's food. And all of those belong to the same family, which is the grass family. So it includes all our cereals and rice. But one of the things it does tell us is that grasses are edible. So in your yard, you can eat grass seeds, or if you're walking on a trail, you can actually run your hand up the stem of crowfoot grass or one of the other grasses and get the seeds, blow off the chaff, and then just pop them in your mouth as a trail snack. So as Zora said, we've identified at least 1,700 edible plants in Central Florida. Most of these grow wild, but all of these can be transplanted into your garden as well. Most wild plants are bitter naturally. So a little bit of cooking makes them more palatable. And probably the golden rule, obviously, is you never, ever, ever, ever put anything into your mouth unless you know exactly what it is. Lots of plants look very similar, and unless you're sure exactly what it is, you don't want to touch it. Many, many years ago, during the Second World War, the Special Forces came up with a thing called the touch test. And it was basically designed for pilots who may be shot down behind enemy lines and in a field full of plants, but they had no idea what that plant was. And so to find out if it was edible, they devised this thing. And so basically what you did is you took a little bit of the leaf and you touched it to your arm just below the elbow, and you left it on there for a few seconds. And if there was no tingling, redness, itching, or anything else, you would hold it up against your lip and repeat the process. And again, if there was no tingling or any other sensation, you put it against your tongue. And if again, after a few seconds, there was nothing, you would eat a very small piece of it. And the chances are that it was edible. And after a few hours, no adverse reactions, you knew that the leaf of that particular plant was edible. So you had a food source. The other thing it told you was that only the leaf is edible, because you'd have to repeat that same test with all the different parts of the plant to confirm that they were all edible. So again, some parts are edible and some are not. And so it's advisable to know which. To learn about foraging and edibles, it's obviously a good idea to go out and buy a good guide. I've written a guide, obviously, which is out there. I think the one thing about guidebooks is that if you're going to buy an edible guidebook, buy one that's in color, because black and white pictures are pretty useless. But the best way to find out about edibles is actually to go out with an expert. And locally, we have a guide called Green Dean, who lives in Maitland. He takes local classes out, and he's probably the world authority on edibles, and especially in Central Florida. He has over 700 videos posted on his website about different edibles, how to find them, how to prepare them, what uses they have. So there are some golden rules about edibles, and single fruits on a stem are generally okay. Blue blackberries are generally okay. Seeds from all grasses, as I said, you can eat. And aggregated fruits like raspberries are obviously okay. And then plants, again, this is a global rule, which is fascinating. So all dollarweed type plants are okay. And you can see the picture of the dollarweed. Dollarweed is nature's way of saying that if you have it in your lawn, something is wrong. You're either overwatering or you've got bad drainage. And most people do have dollarweed somewhere in their lawn, but the good thing is you can actually eat it. And the other good thing is that it comes in various shapes around the world, both terrestrial and aquatic varieties. If you go on the Wekiva River, you can find dollarweed. The leaves are 6 inches across, so you don't need many of those for a salad. But any plant that has that same structure, which is a round leaf with a stem coming up in the middle underneath, any plant that has that same structure anywhere in the world is edible. And another global rule is that all plants that smell like mint, onion, and garlic, even if they're not mint, onion, and garlic, are edible. So if you're actually digging up a root and you've got a root that smells really strongly of garlic, it is edible. And I don't know how these rules evolved, but they work. Pretty much all roots and tubers can be roasted and eaten and dried or crushed as flour. And one of the things that we do at Wekiva is that we have, every couple of years or so, we have a camp for rangers from all over the Southeast US, and we come down and we actually gather up plants, and then we start making flour. We use acorns and cattails and all sorts of other things that can produce flour which you can cook with. A great rule as well is that if it smells of almonds and isn't almonds, you don't eat it because it's almost certainly cyanide. Nature produces a lot of cyanide and strychnine, and so if you have something like Florida bamboo, which is a pretty pathetic plant compared to the tropical varieties, but if you snap open Florida bamboo, you're going to get that smell of almonds, which says that there is cyanide in there. All hard fruits, if you crack open that stone, you're going to get that almond smell as well because they contain cyanide. And it was said that if you eat all the pips of an apple as a child, you could potentially die because all those seeds, pips, contain cyanide as well. And again, the obvious rules: if it looks old, smells bad, or has milky or discolored sap, you don't want to eat it. My son probably would, but generally you don't want to eat it. So you can eat a lot of this stuff raw, but roasting, boiling, grinding, soaking, leaching makes it less bitter and more palatable. Boiling leaves and buds makes them more tender and reduces bitterness and saltiness. Baking, roasting improves the taste of roots and tubers, and you can use all sorts of plants as natural flavorings to spice up things, especially if you're camping. So things like red bay, wild garlic, wild mint, sea lettuce, lemongrass, all of those can be used. That's just a rapid thing. A lot of these you're going to find growing in your lawns, and every one of these is edible. So we'll talk about some of these things later on. And again, at the end of this talk, I'm quite happy to let these slides go over to Katie, and she can distribute them. So some of the roots that can be used as flour: bulrush, cattails, cabbage palm, winged yam. All of these things can be ground up and used as flour. Acorns, particularly, the Native Americans would use acorns as a winter food and cook with it. And interestingly, the inner bark of most trees, except the poisonous varieties, can all be ground for flour. It's interesting that bark, the outer surface of bark is obviously waterproof. The inner surface of bark is where all the nutrients pass from the roots up to the canopy of the trees, and that can be peeled off, and it can be ground up and used as flour, or as one of the rangers demonstrated a few years ago, you can actually strip that inner pine bark and you cut it into strips about 6 inches long, 1/2 inch wide, and you boil it up, and it can be used as a pasta substitute. So some of the interesting plants that are out there, herb potatoes are a pain. There are many varieties of herb potatoes out there now. They're all invasive, and they cause a lot of havoc. They very rarely kill a tree, but they can smother a tree very quickly unless kept under control. But when the Spanish first arrived in America, there were no herb potatoes, the modern varieties as we know now. There was a thing called the winged yam. And herb potatoes, they get the name because they have these look like little potatoes growing up on the vines. They're not edible, whereas the winged yam have what look like little black sausages. And again, they're not edible either, but it has a tuber that can weigh up to 100 pounds. And if a Native American saw a winged yam growing, it would stick a post in the ground, and in the fall, when the vine fell back, it would go and dig the tuber up. And as I say, they could weigh 100 pounds, and that's enough to provide a lot of flour for a village for several days. Amaranth grows pretty much everywhere in Central Florida. It's twice the iron as spinach, and you cook it the same way. American eelgrass, we've talked about, is the richest source of carbohydrates in nature. Avocado, again, a lot of us have it growing in gardens. It's an interesting fact that the leaves are toxic to every creature on earth except humans. So if a dog ate an avocado leaf, it would die. Bitter gourd, it's one of these strange rules about edibles, that it's edible when green but not when it's yellow. But bitter gourds are rich in lycopene, which is obviously used to help a number of cancers. And it's worth mentioning as well that all the plants that I'm talking about are plants that you can find naturally in Central Florida. These are not plants that you bought from a nursery, because sometimes when they produce plants in nurseries, they alter the genetic coding, and that may affect its edibility. So all the plants I talk about are just plants that you would find here in native plant nurseries or growing in the wild. Blue porterweed, which is on the right, is a pretty flower. It has the advantage or the unusual quality that if you actually take a petal and pop it into your mouth, it is like biting into a portobello mushroom. It has the same flavor, texture, taste as that. I mean, it's amazing. You can't cook it like, unfortunately, portobello mushrooms, but it's an interesting experience when you do that. And it's called porterweed because porter, obviously an Old English word for beer, and the Native Americans used to use it to make beer, and also use the flowers and the leaves to make a tea. Cattails, again, if we go back a few hundred years, or even if we go back a few thousand years, there were no rivers at all in Florida. When Florida, the peninsula, rose out of the sea at the end of the Ice Age, there were just sinkholes, basically, and springs. And so the Paleo-Indians who first came about 12,000 years ago, and then the Native Americans who followed them, would always build their little villages next to water sources, and especially those that had cattails, because cattails, every part of the cattail is edible. And then we've got the prickly pear on the right, which is also edible. So every part I said of the cattail is edible. The roots are a rich source of starch. You can actually shake the pollen out of cattails and collect it on a blanket or something and use that as a flour. The young shoots you can pick off and they taste just like asparagus. 1 acre of cattails yields 6,500 pounds of flour, which is enormous and will be enough to keep a small village going for about, well, for most of the winter. Cabbage palm. The cabbage palm used to be called the tree of life. It's also called the sable palm. It's the state tree of Florida, which, as you all know, is wrong because palms are not members of the tree. They're members of the grass family. But again, the Native Americans called it the tree of life because every part could be used. So the roots, the buds, and the heart, and they would use the stems for the villages, the huts. In Florida, they didn't have tents. They built a hut, which they lived in during the summer, which didn't have walls, but would have knotted leaves, which could be rolled up for ventilation. And then during the winter, they would actually put in solid walls. And again, all of that was used. They used the leaves for thatching. The cactus, every cactus in North America is edible except 2, which are found in Oregon and Washington. And so we don't really have to worry about those. But certainly, again, every part of the cactus is edible. And the prickly pear, which is one of the most common in Central Florida, you can make jam, obviously, out of the fruit, and you can eat the flowers. But the pad is really important as well. And anybody who's ever touched a prickly pear will know that it's covered in spikes and also tiny little hairs which get into your skin. So one way to get rid of those is to actually stab the pad with one knife and cut off that pad from the rest of the cactus, and then hold it over a fire for a few seconds, and that burns away all the hairs and the spiky bits. And then you can peel the pad open, and inside there is a green mush, which is like avocado, but it's 85% water, because that's where the cactus stores all its water. So you can eat that. It's an aside, but my son is with Customs and Border Protection. He's based out in San Diego, right on the Mexican border, and it's called High Desert. It's 7,500 feet, 120 degrees heat during the day, And one of the worst things he has to do is go around and collect bodies of people that have come across at night time. And they've been told to just hang out during the day and then maybe work their way to a road where they're going to get picked up the following night. But they don't have water, and then 120 degrees, they dehydrate very quickly and die. And the irony is they're surrounded by cactuses which are packed with water, which could have saved their lives. Cocoa plum, we don't have that many in Central Florida, but again, some people have it in their gardens. And as you get closer to the Atlantic coast, it becomes more common. And again, the fruit is 90% water, so it's a great rehydration source as well. And then crowfoot grass, again, most common grass in Wekiva Springs. You can walk along the trails and just grab the seeds and eat them as a snack. Dollarweed we've talked about. Again, it's telling you that your lawn is too wet or has bad drainage. But it's saying you eat that stuff. One of the reasons why it's important to know exactly what it is you're eating is that here we have the elderflower and the water hemlock, both found in exactly the same place. One, every part of it you can eat, and the other one, every part of is going to kill you. So elderflower, you can take those wonderful flowers and you can actually put them in a bucket with about a gallon of water and add some sugar and then cover it with a muslin cloth and just leave it for a few days. And it will attract natural yeasts from the atmosphere and start bubbling and fermenting. And after about 10 days, you have what's called a mock champagne. It's very mild alcoholic, maybe 1%, but it's a very fizzy, refreshing summer drink. And of course, you've got berries, which you can actually make wine from as well. And then again, you can eat the young leaves and you can eat the roots. Whereas the water hemlock, it's not really that similar, and you can always tell them apart because the water hemlock has the little red tinges to the stems, as you can see. Water hemlock has the advantage of producing a poison that is almost untraceable. And so in the old days, the kings and queens of Europe always had a food taster because the favored poison of the day was made from water hemlock. And so the food taster would always taste the food first, just to make sure it was okay for the king and the queen. Not a job that much security I would have thought. But Eastern coral bean, again, is in the top there. Grows profusely everywhere. It has very distinctive arrow-shaped leaves. It has these very long red flowers that can only be pollinated by hummingbirds. So that's an evolution over many thousands of years. So no hummingbirds, no Eastern coral bean, and vice versa. The Eastern coral bean, every part of it can be eaten except the bean. And the bean grows in a horseshoe-shaped pod. Starts out green and it finishes up bright red. And if you go to the Caribbean, you can actually buy necklaces that are made out of coral beans. And one of the problems is that you may bring that necklace home, the string breaks, and one of those beans actually runs under a sofa where it's found by a child. And if he or she pops it into her mouth, it's going to be dead in about 6 hours. It's one of the most toxic substances to be found in Florida. We have about 107 varieties of fern grow locally, and all ferns are edible. You can see on the bottom right, there's the fiddlehead, which is when it comes up and the top of the plant is curled over like the end of a violin. It's a delicacy in the northeast of the US where they fry it up in butter. But again, you can eat it here as well. Fireweed, it's called fireweed because it's one of the first plants that emerges after a burn, whether natural or prescribed. And if you can split the stem open, you can actually eat the pith out of it, and it's packed with proteins and nutrients. The bottom left here, we have foxgrape. When the Spanish arrived, there was only one variety of natural grape in Florida, and that was the muscadine grape. And it's we've been out doing walks this year. I have never seen so many grapes actually on the vines. So yeah, they're very prolific at the moment. But the Spanish didn't like it. They thought it wasn't a very sophisticated grape, so they started introducing European varieties and crossbreeding, and they finished up with something which is now called the fox grape, or the dog grape. And whilst you can use the leaves for cooking, the grapes themselves, fox grapes, are so acidic that if you rub them in your hand, it will take the skin off your palms. So, but interesting thing about any wild vine, a grapevine that is out there, that if it's thicker than about your thumb, you can actually chop it off at ground level and then chop it off about 6 feet above the ground and hold it up, and the water will drip out. And in that 6 feet of length, you're going to get about a pint of clear water, because again, that's where the vine stores its water. So in a survival situation, if you're looking for water, that's a really good place to look for it. Lichens. Lichen is the only known synergistic relationship between fungi and algae. And lichens are those blotches that you see on trees. They cause a lot of problems in the path because we have a number of trails, and we blaze our trails with a dab of paint. And the white trail is our biggest trail in the park, runs for 13 miles. And often people mistake a big clump of lichen, a white lichen on the tree, as the path, and go off and get lost. Lichens, though, are edible. If you took your knife out and you scraped the lichen onto the blade and popped it in your mouth, it will pucker your cheeks because it is so bitter, but it is packed with carbohydrates and proteins. So again, a good source in a survival situation. A more palatable way of taking it is to scrape off a lot of lichen and to put it into a mug of hot water and then drink it like a tea. The Native Americans, I'm not sure how they did it, they actually produced an alcohol from it as well. We have 3 different sorts, major sorts of lichen in the park. I mean, many, many more, but the 3 common ones are the white one, which is white blanket lichen, red blanket lichen, and then we have Christmas lichen, which is similar to the red blanket lichen, except it has a very distinct red outer rim, which is actually caused by bacteria. So again, that's 3 different organisms coming together. Maples, again, pretty much if you've got maples, you've got food for life. You can eat the leaves, the sap, the seeds, the inner bark. You can take a small bud of maple and drop it in your tea if you forgot your sugar or coffee, and it will add natural sweetness to it. Nettles are great as well. It's nice to see that Publix are selling spring greens that contain nettles. Every part, again, of the nettle is edible. The young leaves can be eaten raw, put into salads. The older ones should be boiled, but only for a few seconds. And then the oaks. Basically, in Florida, we have 2 types of oaks. We have white oaks and red oaks. And the white oaks are predominantly led by the live oak family, and the red oaks by turkey oaks and others. But the difference between the 2 is that white oaks have acorns every year, and red oaks have acorns every 2 years. And you can grind both types of acorns up for flour, or you can roast them for a coffee substitute. The white oaks are a lot less bitter than the red oaks. And so the easy way to do that is to put them into a bucket of water, and the most bitter will actually drop to the bottom of the bucket. The less bitter will stay sort of floating somewhere down, not floating, but somewhere submerged. And the acorns that you don't want to eat will float to the top, mostly because they've been drilled into by some insects or something, or they're bad. But again, you can actually make a passable coffee from them, but they're much more useful as flour. And of course, the Native Americans would gather up acorns and use them as a winter food. So they would gather them up and put them in big baskets, bury them, ideally in water, because the process of water running over the acorns is going to leach them and make them a lot less bitter. Pines. again, you can eat the inner bark of the pine, you can eat the shoots, you can eat the young needles, they're rich in vitamins A and C, and you can use the sap as well. You can stick a knife in, get a little bit of sap and eat that straight off your blade. Young pine cones are rich in testosterone as well. And again, everybody at least at some point in their life should try pine needle tea, because it's not only very tasty, but it's also very beneficial as well. So you can actually cut up, especially longleaf pines, which are the longest pine needles, cut them up into about 1 inch long chunks, and then put them in hot water and seep them. And you seep them for, depending on, whatever your taste is. So you experiment, but 10 minutes and you have a really nice, invigorating, refreshing drink. Pokeweed is one of these very strange plants that you can eat the young leaves and stems, but you can only eat them after you're boiling them twice. So at some point in history, somebody boiled them once and ate them and then died. They're toxic when they're raw, and they're pretty toxic when you boil them once. But what persuaded them then to try again and say, well, what happens if we boil them twice? But somebody obviously did, and so that's the way of preparing them now. Purslane, all parts are edible and massively packed with vitamins and minerals. And then rattlesnake weed, Florida betony, on the bottom right. You can eat the roots raw. Again, they grow a bit like carrots. They love sandy soil, so you can just grab the leaves and pull them straight out of the soil or the sand and shake them. And then they look a little bit like rattlesnake tails, but they taste like water chestnuts. And again, they're packed with water. So it's a very good trail snack. Reindeer moss. Again, it's one of these strange things. It's another lichen, and reindeer don't eat it, so how it got its name, I've no idea. But again, it's one of these weird plants that often on a sunny day you would never see it, because it just disappears as a black smudge on a rock. When it starts to get humid and it rains, it develops and develops and grows like this. And the Native Americans would gather big handfuls, and then they would put it in hot water and they would drink it again as an invigorating drink. Sandspur, bottom left. We all know sandspurs. They're the horrible spiky things that stick to our socks and hurt like heck if we touch them. So you get your own back. You actually cut them off at the ground, hold it over a fire for a few seconds. The heat of the fire will actually burn off the spikes, and it will actually force the seed case to open up, and then you just eat it. So instead of having s'mores around the campfire, you can actually have sandspur seeds, which are much healthier. And then saw palmetto, again, you got the berries. You can eat the new leaves and shoots, massively packed with fatty acids, so really good for you. And then again, young shoots and stems. The trouble with palmetto berries is that the gopher tortoises love them. So as soon as they're ripe, they normally gobble them up. It's one of the biggest problems in the park, though, because there are people who will pay a high price for palmetto berries. They come in poaching and they will steal them. So we have to try and stop them. Skunk vine, which is the top right, which is a very pretty little flower. And I think skunk vine gets a bad rap. I mean, it sometimes smells quite badly, and more so after rain. But you can eat it. You can eat the flowers and you can eat the leaves, and you chop them up, put them in salads or add them to stews. It does have little brown berries, which if you pop them open do smell horrible. So that's something to avoid. But again, it's a pretty little plant, and it will grow well in your garden, and then you've got another food source. And then bottom left, we have the bull thistle, sometimes called the sow thistle. It favors areas where horses have been, and so it will grow. It has this distinctive sort of pinky purple flower on top, will grow to be at 6 feet high. But again, every part of that plant is edible, although it's surprising. You can actually boil up the leaves, and boiling will actually get rid of a lot of the spikiness But the best way of eating that is to take your knife out and to run your knife down the stem, taking off all the leaves and the spiky bits, and then you can chop the stem up into sections and eat it just like celery, and it tastes just like that. And again, it's where it stores all its water, so it's a great rehydration source. And then Spanish moss, another plant that gets a bad rap. We've done lots of tests in the park. If it's on the ground, it can often be infested, with chiggers and other things. But often when it's growing in the tree, it's still a living plant. And if you actually climb up the tree, you will find the growing tip. And that's a little ball which has hundreds of little green growths on it, all of which you can nibble off. The plant looks like this because to protect it from the heat and also to prevent moisture, losing moisture, the leaves are actually covered in this what looks like dead material. So that is how it's evolved to survive. One of the interesting things is that one of the things that we do at Guyver is I run survival classes, and I will braid Spanish moss, and you can braid it into a rope that's strong enough to tow a car. And it's also another member of the lichen family. And again, the Native Americans would actually take balls of that and drink it in hot water. It's antibacterial, antifungal, antiseptic, antimalarial, anti all sorts of great things. Spatterdock and American lotus, two of the things that we have in our ponds and on our rivers, both edible. The nice thing about the American lotus on the right is that the seed tray, and it literally is a tray, is very accessible. If you're canoeing and you want a snack, you can just snap off that seed tray and just pick out the seeds and eat it. You have to work a little harder to get to the seeds of the spatterdock. But again, as I said, all parts are edible. There was a report from China a couple of months ago that they had just produced lotus seedlings from plants, from seeds that they knew were at least 400 years old. So it's a survivor. If there's a drought, it can just, the seeds lie dormant in the mud or wherever. But again, the Native Americans used to love it. 1 pound of flour made from American lotus seeds contains 1,475 calories, so it's very nutritious. So a little bit about just some medicinal plants. Beautyberry, I think we all recognize the beautyberry. Again, it's going to be a bumpy year this year because the plants are packed with little berries, which will, as we get towards the fall, turn to a deep purple color. You can eat the berries and you can make a jelly from them. Each berry itself is packed with tiny little, lots and lots of little seeds. It has almost no flavor, but it's packed with vitamins, so it's a good source of nutrients. The most important thing about the beautyberry, I think, is that the leaves are about 4 times more effective when you scrunch them up as a DEET insect repellent. So you take the leaf, you scrunch it up, you rub it on your skin, and it will stop you being bitten for about 45 minutes to an hour, and then it will evaporate. The nice thing is if you're going on a walk, you can take a bag of leaves, and then they are not affected until you scrunch them up. So when you feel it's time to replace your protection, you actually scrunch them up, rub them on. The good thing is beautyberry is found everywhere, and saying it's a really good plant as an insect repellent, as is lemongrass and dried cattails. You can take bunches of those, hang them from your back porch or your tent if you're camping or whatever. It will keep the insects away. Biden's alba, which is great. It's been used for hundreds of years to alleviate sore throats. And again, it's a nice plant. You can actually have it in your garden. Blackberry is one of those interesting plants that if you eat too many blackberries, you get diarrhea. If you eat blackberry leaves, it cures diarrhea. I'm not sure what happens if you actually eat them together, if it cancels the other out, but camphor, we have a lot of camphor trees in Central Florida. They were introduced as ornamentals, And in about 1987, 78, a politician in Tallahassee decided they all need to be eradicated because they contain safrole, which is an ingredient of ecstasy. And whilst they do contain safrole, that is true, you need about 5 PhDs and $1 million lab to actually do it. So luckily the idea was dropped, and we still have our camphor trees, and they grow in most of our public parks. You can actually make a tea from the leaves, which is great for decongestants. So if you suffer from allergies or hay fever, that sort of thing, it works very efficiently. Cattails, we've already said, they're great insect repellents. Dock leaves, I should have mentioned about cattails as well, because most of the things we see when we see cattails, we see the old female seed pod, which is the brown bit, as you can see down at the bottom. When that is green, you can actually harvest it, and you can actually put it on the barbie and cook it like sweet corn. Doesn't taste like it, but it's still edible. But again, it's free food. Dock leaves, we have lots and lots of dock leaves. Dock leaves all over the world are astringent, which means they have a power to draw out. So the Native Americans, if a child had a splinter, they would wrap it around, and the leaf would actually draw the splinter slowly out. They thought it would also do the same with snake bites. It actually didn't. Dog fennel in the top left is interesting. It almost always grows where beautyberry grows as well. It grows massively in the park. About more years ago, the largest body of water in Wekiva is Lake Previtt, and it dried up during a drought. And within 3 months, the entire lake bed was covered by dog fennel. It will rapidly invade and take over. The advantage of green dog fennel is that if you do get bitten because you forgot to put your beautyberry leaf on, you can actually take green dog fennel and run it over the itchy bit, and it will take the itch and the sting away. So again, nature has an answer for pretty much everything. Feverfew, again, it's a pretty plant to have in your yard, but again, you can use it to make a tea to relieve headaches and fever. And Florida betony is another great way of naturally curing headaches. Hercules club. Once you've seen a Hercules club tree, you never forget it, because you can see the bottom right, the bark, it's gnarly, it's covered in spikes and warts and all sorts of things. It has a unique quality in that you can make a tea from the leaves that only affects the nerves in your gum. So if you have toothache, you can make a tea and it will ease the toothache. It has no effect on any other part of the body, and scientists have no idea why, but it's something that's been discovered over hundreds of years. Yaupon, I'm sure that many of you know that the Latin name for yaupon is Ilex vomitoria, so that you drink too much, it's going to make you vomit. It's the only naturally occurring caffeinated plant in North America. And when the Native American young men were about to go into battle or whatever, they would purge themselves. They would go into a sweat tent for 2 or 3 days, and they would have enormous fires burning, and then they would drink huge amounts of yaupon tea made with many, many leaves. And it caused them to purge from every orifice, but it cleansed them, which is why they did it. It's now used frequently as a hedge plant, and you can still actually make a really nice tea, but you only need 2 or 3 leaves. So moderation is the key in this particular one. Lemongrass, we said, is an insect repellent. Mimosa, again, beautiful plant to have in your garden. And has been used for again, hundreds of years to, help aid with depression and anxiety. And then the paperbark tree, again, which grows very commonly in Wekiwa. Native Americans used to use that as toilet paper because the leaves are very large. One side is smooth, one side is rough. So you take your pick, and it's biodegradable. And during the toilet paper shortage last year, I was trying to persuade my wife to switch over, but she declined. So, a passion flower. The passion flower on the top left, it's a beautiful flower. And if you want to actually impress guests and you're making a salad, put a passion flower in the middle of your plate, put the rest of the salad around it, and it's a wonderful decoration. And it has to be said that pretty much all flowers are edible. And it's a problem sometimes if my wife, who collects orchids, we go into an orchid shop. The owner doesn't like me nibbling on the plants, but orchid flowers, blooms are really quite tasty. And again, now a lot of modern cuisine is using petals as decoration. In the peppergrass is good as a diuretic. Again, you can make a tea. Pine resin is apart from being edible, it has another use. If you were, say, hiking along the Appalachian Trail miles from anywhere, and you were you bit down on a nut and broke a filling, you can actually take your knife out and stick it into the pine tree, get a bit of resin on the end of the blade, mix it with some sand, and pack it into your hole where the filling was, and it provides a temporary filling for up to 28 days. We have pine trees everywhere. If you hate the dentist, you can self-medicate now for the rest of your lives. Plantago and plantain are both good for poultices. You take some leaves and you chew them up, and then you slap them on to a bite or a sting, and it will take the itching away. Again, plantain also is good. You can chew it if you've got a toothache, and it will relieve that. Royal fern, which is the largest of the ferns in North America. It grows about 6 feet high. It doesn't really have what I consider typical fern leaves. But during the Civil War, it saved hundreds or thousands of lives because there were no medicines to treat the troops. And one of the native scouts told the doctor that if they took the root of the royal fern and boiled it up, it would produce an ointment that they could actually put into the wounds. And subsequently, University of Florida, God bless them, they did some research, and they discovered that it's antibacterial, antiseptic, antifungal, antimalarial, anti-everything there is. So it's an enormously powerful healing plant. Cider, again, it contains naturally occurring ephedrine. So again, you can treat asthma and hay fever and allergies with it. Make a tea. Spanish moss, again, as an antibacterial drink. Tea bags, not sure why it is there, except tea bags are really useful, apart from being British, and we drink a lot of tea. You can actually use the cold tea bags, put them on burns and sunburn. It will relieve the sting very quickly. And then turkey tail fungi, which grows on dead wood that's fallen down. It likes oak trees that have fallen down. It first appears as a very small white blob, which the early settlers used to use as a chewing gum. And then it grows, and it's called a wedge fungi because it sort of grows in this semicircular shape, and it resembles an extended turkey tail. All the time it's flexible. You can eat it. But again, it has enormous medical properties. But when it gets hard, it becomes non-palatable, but they make jewelry from it, and they put it little pieces into brooches and pendants. Usnea is another lichen in the top right. It grows on tops of trees, on dead woods, on tops of trees, and so when there's a storm, it falls to the ground and you can pick it up. When the Native Americans went into battle, they would actually have balls of this in a leather pouch around their neck. And it wasn't a magic charm. If they were actually wounded, they would pack that ball of usnea into the wound, and it would heal faster without any side effects. The nice thing is it keeps its efficacy for 5 years, but we have so much of it in Central Florida that you can actually go and pick it up after any major storm event and get it. Violets are good for headaches. Water hyssop I'll come back to in a second. And then wild mint, you can actually chew wild mint. Again, it's got antiseptic properties. Willow twigs are a great survival food. If you see willow trees, you know you're near water. It contains salicin, the young twigs, so you can chew those, and it's good for headaches. And you can actually make a bark, a tea, which is good for fever. And then yarrow on the right, we had an incident in one of our parks a few months ago where a lady cut herself very badly. You can take the flower head of yarrow, squash it up, and slap it onto the wound, and the bleeding stops almost immediately. It's quite remarkable. Wild rose, almost at the end. So thing about the wild rose, again, it doesn't have to be wild, it can be in your garden as well. But every part of the plant has a different medicinal use, which is incredible. And then if you put them all together, all the parts together, and now being used to treat bladder and kidney problems as well. Now I just want to go back to where is my water hyssop. Last plant I want to talk about is that water hyssop grows everywhere in Central Florida. It's been used for hundreds of years to help people with memory problems. And several years ago, they started to work in France. They actually had lab mice, which they gave dementia to. However they do that, I'm not. But either way, what they did is they were able to give these mice with dementia extracts of water hyssop. And when you have dementia, we do know that it's a buildup of plaque in the brain, which prevents neurons, when they're fired, from connecting. They hit this wall of plaque and can't get through. When they gave the mice the extract of water hyssop, the neurons fired and penetrated the plaque and connected as if it wasn't there. And about 3 years ago, the FDA gave approval for clinical trials in America, and we haven't heard anything since. It's interesting that earlier this week, the first new dementia drug was approved by the FDA, first one in 20 years. So maybe water hyssop will provide an answer down the road. But it just shows that there are plants out there that have these magical curative qualities that we just don't know about, because in the old days, people never wrote these things down, and often all that information has just gone by the wayside, unfortunately. And as we're talking about edibles, I'll just final thing say that if it moves, crawls, swims, or flies, you can eat it. All black beetles in the world are edible, which is a good thing to know. And grasshoppers, termites, other insects, it's best to cook them. And my final thought is that if you like cockroaches, if you like peanut butter, you love cockroaches, because peanut butter is just like crispy peanut butter. So, but anyhow, anything can be eaten, but again, I think it's a lot better to actually have stuff in your garden that you can not only admire because of its beauty, but also eat as well. And especially if the alternative is actually putting chemicals on. So at that point, I will shut up. Thank you.
We do have some questions both on Facebook and on the Q&A here. So first one was, they missed the website of the guide in Maitland.
Green Dean. His website is called eattheweeds.com.
All right, so eattheweeds.com with Green Dean for the website of the guide. We've got dandelions are safe to eat and very edible, but they have milky sap. Is that an exception? What are the other exceptions?
Usnea is another exception. Usnea, if you actually pull it apart, you'll see it has almost like an elastic band made of white inside. The exception, those are the only two main exceptions that I know.
Cocoa plum has a milky sap, which I don't find pleasant.
But you shouldn't be eating that. The fruit of the cocoa plum is pretty much the only part you want to eat on that one. The dandelion is interesting in a way, as an aside, because again, all the parts of the dandelion you can eat. During the Seminole Wars, they rounded up all the Seminoles and they put them in little camps. And the Native Americans would actually use dandelion sap to write messages between each other, because when you write on a bit of paper using dandelion sap, you see nothing at all. And what you have to do is you have to squeeze lemon juice on it, and then it's like secret writing. You squeeze lemon juice on it and you can actually see what we've written. So for years and years, the Native Americans were passing messages around, and the Americans never understood what was going on, because they just thought, why are they passing blank bits of paper? So.
And then Marty has asked 4 different times, where do we get your book from? Amazon doesn't seem to have it for sale.
Yes, it does. So I wasn't trying to promote it because I know I'm not supposed to push things with Master Gardeners, but edible, if you just put my name in and Edible Florida, it will come up.
And then if somebody, are the small green saw palmetto seeds good for anything, or should she wait until they're black to pick?
Sorry, which ones?
The small green saw palmetto seeds. So should she wait until they're black, or can she use them while they're green?
Advisable to wait until they're fully ripe. You can eat them. They do have a little toxicity when they're young, and the reason for not eating them is they taste horrible. So why would you eat them? But to be honest, yeah, it's an acquired taste when they're ripe as well. But there are a lot of people that don't appreciate the ripe palmetto berry taste.
That's like, I was excited because I had elderberry in my backyard and I'd never eaten it before, and I ate that first berry and I was like, oh, the mockingbirds can eat these.
You can make a really nice wine from it.
Yeah.
But I say the flowers are fun. I mean, if you gather those flowers heads and put them in a bucket, you can make your own champagne. And I say it's almost a non-alcoholic champagne, but it's very refreshing in the summer.
All right. Any other questions for Dawn? Then could you confirm mimosa, the native version, powder puff mimosa, also known as sunshine mimosa? Oh, when you were talking about the mimosa earlier, were you talking about the sunshine mimosa, or were you talking about a different one?
I don't know the term sunshine. I mean, it's the native Floridian variety. Okay. It's the one that you're going to find in the wild growing here.
The ground cover one?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
And again, I just caveat again that everything I'm talking about are native Florida plants, so nothing cultivated commercially. Yeah.
All right. You guys will be getting a survey after this just to ask you if you learned anything or not. It's like 4 questions long. So if you don't mind taking that survey, it lets us know if you learned anything or not today. Hopefully you learned a lot. I know I did listening to you, Dawn. And if we don't have any further questions, we'll go ahead and end almost right on time. So thank you so much for coming and talking to us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thanks.